Hi, everyone, and welcome. Today I am joined by Alexander Mercouris and Andrei Nekrasov, a world-renowned film director who has made many excellent films, including the 2016 film The Magnitsky Act. And our topic today is more or less narrative control, in which films such as The Magnitsky Act, I would argue, is quite relevant. In terms of development of narratives, narratives which lay the foundations for very severe sanctions, but also what happens when you challenge the narrative, as we have seen. So some of the things we'll discuss is what was the narrative sold to push the Magnitsky Act versus reality, and also what happened to the documentary of Nekrasov on the Magnitsky Act, as this is quite troubling censorship. And Mr. Nekrasov, I guess you found yourself in a strange position, as you initially, of course, very sympathetic, of course, to the passing of Sergey Magnitsky, well, still, I assume, but you became very critical of the Magnitsky case, and to many people, this might have seemed strange, as you were, I guess, well known for producing many films critical of the Kremlin. But in these days, when everything is binary, support our narrative or theirs, many would see then looking for suspicious motivations, I guess. But well, I guess from my perspective, reality should be objective on its own. So I guess your documentary about Magnitsky was initially based to a large extent on the story told by Bill Browder. However, once you delved into this, you became more critical. So I guess, well, I was hoping you could give us maybe start off with a bit overview of how you approached this documentary.
Yeah, thank you. Well, a bit of a background is that I was quite active in the what's called Russian opposition. Of course, opposition is in some ways is a misnomer, because opposition in the UK and other democracies is we talk of parliamentary opposition, whereas in Russia I was a member of some groups, organizations, which were I'd call them civil society groups, because there's an opposition in the Duma, which is sometimes problematic, because there's more and more control in Russia as well. It's to do with the war and certain processes, but we're talking about the Magnitsky film was made in between 2014 and 2016, and I approached the topic, the life and death of Sergey Magnitsky, from the, let's put it, opposition point of view. I believed the storyteller behind this narrative, Bill Browder, who was Magnitsky's boss, a hedge fund manager. Sergey Magnitsky was an accountant, whom Browder calls a lawyer, tax lawyer, which I subsequently discovered he wasn't. Magnitsky wasn't a lawyer. Magnitsky was an accountant, but I did believe Browder, and I also believe the wider context, which is that Magnitsky was a proactive fighter for democracy. He was an anti-corruption whistleblower, according to Browder. And what I'm trying to say is that politically, I was inclined to believe all that, because I myself was, and still am to a large extent, a critic of the Russian government. But even though I must say that this whole saga with the film, the way it was released and actually not released, not run by some TV news organizations which actually commissioned it and paid for it in the West. So it was essentially cancelled. So it did of course color my whole attitude on this, on the what I actually believed wholeheartedly. The West is all about freedom of information, and Russia is just if not a dictatorship, which I don't think, even then I didn't think that Russia was a dictatorship some 10, 15 years ago, but a harshly controlled society, which is the opposite of democracy, the opposite of Western democracy, and even Western civilization. Because as I think I want to also talk to you about the Magnitsky story and the whole context is far. It's not just a Russian story of a hedge fund manager and his accountant. It's not any story, exciting and tragic, actually, as it is. For me, it's become a something that reflects this very important period of Russian history and European history and world history. As we remember, Fukuyama, famously or infamously, as far as I'm concerned, said, "This is the end of history." The end of 1989, 91, when the Berlin Wall fell and the system of state socialism in Europe collapsed. That was admitted, presumably, at the end of history. No, it wasn't, and we now see nothing of the kind. So the Magnitsky story actually tells us a lot about the deeper meaning of what happened to Russia, what happened to Europe, what happened to the world. So we might want to talk about it as well. But yes, essentially, I approached the Magnitsky story believing Bill Browder and the official version. If you look up at Wikipedia or anywhere, because 99% of the world media would still call Sergey Magnitsky a whistleblower, will repeat what I think is a lie. Browder's version of the events, that Magnitsky was brutally murdered in a jail by Russian riot guards. But that's, as I said, these are just some facts. And as I said, I've discovered that Magnitsky was not brutally murdered. Browder says he died tragically. And we can talk also about the state of Russian prisons. That's another matter. But he wasn't intentionally murdered. And so having believed that, I then already, while making the film, that's also rather extraordinary. And that's those twists and turns, they are all in the film. We see how I kind of genuinely praise even Browder, at our first meetings for his what I then thought was an investigation into Magnitsky's death. And then, while already making it, I realized that Browder lied, that the media followed, the Western media followed Browder's narrative, very often just not even intentionally, but just refusing to consider the different versions, etc., etc. So we can, as I said, it's much larger. It's much more important than just a story. Which important to say is that we have to separate the question of human rights and this a story of a financial crime, essentially. The tendency to see Russia in this human rights light, which may be warranted, but this is a separate question. So kind of letting these rather general political opinions about Russia color analysis and facts of economic processes, financial crimes. In this case, this is what Magnitsky case is about. Is not only is it inaccurate, it's dangerous. It's dangerous because it leads to this kind of the logic of provocation, the logic of imposing sanctions on people who are not in this. Many people who were sanctioned by the Magnitsky sanctions regimes. There's one in America, there's one in Europe, did not commit any crimes and did not have an opportunity to, like in a normal court of law, you're allowed to, basically you're given a day in court, you're given a lawyer to represent you. None of that works in the Magnitsky sort of way of punishing people, and so.
Well, absolutely. Can I absolutely recommend to people that you can actually find the film, despite the various attempts to make it more difficult. There are actually plenty of places you can find the film, and I think it is an absolutely compelling story because, of course, what the film does is it actually describes the narrative, and it starts with an attempt by yourself to create a film based around the narrative. And as you, a filmmaker, try to recreate the film objectively around the narrative actually begins to fall apart. That is what makes the film so compelling and so very interesting. And over the course of the film also, you find various different individuals, different participants in the film, including, by the way, Browder himself. They start to behave in ways that are radically discordant from the narrative. But I think you have made a number of very important points here. Firstly, important point one is that there is an argument, there's a very strong case that the way that Magnitsky was treated did involve genuine infringements of his rights and of his legal rights. The way that he was imprisoned, the whole process of investigation, you could argue that there were serious faults in it. But that is not the same as saying that the narrative that was constructed around him is necessarily true. In fact, it isn't. And of course, many of the faults in the investigation process, many of the faults in the detention process, and in the way that he is treated whilst in detention. And I have to say this, and I say this from knowledge, you can also find replicated in Western societies as well. But what made the narrative so compelling and so attractive, I think, to many people in the West is, and why they still cling to it, despite the evidence which you have produced, which starts to crack it, to basically disassemble it, is because, like so many of these stories that are made up about Russia, people believe it because they they already think they know in advance that it must be true. It corresponds to their own conception of what Russia is, and it fits into it almost exactly. Corrupt policemen, politicians who are manipulating legal processes, organized crime, working with the police in all sorts of ways, a heroic Western businessmen trying to clean up the country. This is a very attractive narrative for many people in the West, and it's one that many, many people in the West want to believe in. And here a film comes along which says that on this particular case, this most important case, that isn't actually what happened. And there is a very strong reaction. You actually see that with some people in the film itself. A German MEP, for example, is speechless with horror when the facts are presented to her. And that desire to believe in a particular narrative is one which affects all discussion about Russia. It explains why article after article can be written and spread about any topic relating to Russia that you can imagine. The way the politics are conducted there, the way government works there, the way foreign policy works, the way the Ukraine crisis has played out. And because there's always this assumption that we know the country already, that we have our own pre-existing conception of it, these narratives become very powerful and become very, very difficult to challenge. Now, would you agree with that?
Well, absolutely. And what I also mention it and like to expand a little bit on is this whole period, the post communist period, which is now already more than 30 years. The Magnitsky case, I'd say, is a very short. Well, I mean, it's a sprawling case because Browder essentially was accused in Russia of tax evasion, and then he took certain measures to cover it up. And Magnitsky was involved as his accountant. But it might sound complicated and very Russian, but as I said, it goes well beyond that. And look, what you may have heard that for the Russian, that the 90s, which in the West may refer just to fashion or the kind of music that people listen to in the 90s. But for the Russians, the 90s is an extremely traumatic period which followed the collapse of the Soviet Union, which, in my humble opinion, led to what is threatening the world order and maybe even the world's security. And we might be on the brink of, or were, hopefully not for much longer, the Third World War. It is all connected. It is, of course, connected, because I believe that like in 17th century Britain, there was not one revolution. There were a couple or a few, and the Civil War. And these processes are extremely. They're long, they're painful, and they're extremely complex. So, forgive me for going as far as these historical allusions, but what is Magnitsky? What is the Magnitsky case? One William Browder turns up in Russia in the 90s, those traumatic 90s, where essentially and something unprecedented was happening. A huge economy the Soviet economy was up for grabs, and fortunes were made overnight. Literally, it's completely unprecedented as far as your historian. Let me correct me if I'm wrong. Trillions, not even billions, of dollars in today's worth were changing hands instantly. So people like Browder sussed out. He, by the way, is the grand son of ironically, of the leader of the U.S. Communist Party in the 20th century, who was the leader of the Communist Party over a long period of time, including the Second World War. So he ran for president, but no chances. But he was an important figure, and and I don't know. I asked Bill how does he feel being a grandson of a communist number one of the U.S. And he was. He realized that it was a huge paradox, because there he was, profiting, if not profiteering, from the collapse of communism and making a lot of money. So Magnitsky was his accountant, helping. Because it was what does it mean make money? In his case, it was a hedge fund, and it was taking advantage of certain loopholes in the Russian tax laws, which were very loose, and the Russian government now admits it wasn't very good legislation. There were opportunities to bend the law. Yeah, as they say in Britain, bend the law, but he also did break it, and didn't pay tax, was caught, and then, as I said, there was a sort of a series of cover up operation, which led to the what we do know. As I said, the Magnitsky case is complicated, but then Magnitsky was arrested as a witness to this previous tax evasion case, and then there was another sort of tax crime, when $230 million was stolen there's an equivalent of that in Western economies called cum-ex, very rough equivalent. But anyway, there was a scam, and Magnitsky was arrested for it. And by the way, sorry to digress a little bit, you mentioned that the arrest was illegal, but actually the European Court of Human Rights did rule that the arrest itself and the investigation of Magnitsky, and consequently of Browder, because it's the same case, was actually, there was nothing illegitimate about that. No. That the police, actually the Russian police, did act. The European Court of Human Rights did not find a bad faith evidence of them acting illegitimately or with that faith. The way Magnitsky was then treated in prison is another matter. But the investigation was genuine.
Yes,
and Browder was convicted for tax evasion in Russia. So, okay, this is a story of financial crime, but look at it from it's in the context of a bigger picture. So you have this gentleman, this American Browder, arriving there, and look, if he is right and the story he's telling is true, it essentially means that because he was very typical, he was one of the first, and according to he's saying he was the biggest investor. I'm not sure, but he was one of the bigger ones. Okay, so if he's right, if he didn't commit any financial crime, he claims he didn't. It was politically motivated, and if Magnitsky was murdered, as he claims, this means that the general narrative of kind of the West. No one is an angel. Nobody claims that the West, did not pursue its own agenda. But the general kind of positive narrative for the West is that communism, an evil system, collapsed, and the West came to Russia to help. Essentially, it came, like Browder claims he did, to share its knowledge about capitalism, which is of course not ideal. But especially as you're a grandson of a communist #1 in the US, okay, fine, fair enough. It's not ideal, but still, it's better than communism, right? And we tactfully, with a lot of care, try to educate you, the Soviets, ex-Soviets, the Russians, how to deal with this. How we try to teach you to trade shares. That's what Browder's business was. He was making money on this, basically shares going from the communist shares or the equivalent or whatever to capitalist shares. The golden moment, of course. But this was all done kind of in good faith. That's the key. If it's done in good faith, then all this paranoia, one would say, about the West on the part of Putin, on the part of the today, most Russians actually view the West with suspicion. They don't trust the West. It's all wrong. It's Russian paranoia. It's also intentional, lying by the Russian government, who accuses the West of this, that, and the other. But if Browder is wrong, if he did commit financial crimes, if Magnitsky wasn't murdered, as he claims, and I believe lies, intentionally murdered. So this gives certain credence to the, roughly speaking, Russian narrative. So Russians do have the reasons not to trust people like Browder and many, many others, including some of the gurus of capitalism. Some did the money, but others, like Harvard, famous whatever Harvard boys or Chicago boys, whatever they're called. So there was, I'm not saying everybody in the West. There are a lot of naive and well-intentioned people in the West, of course. Okay, but this is a very, very important thing. Because apropos Marxism, communism, whatever, whether you're left or not so left wing, everybody must admit that the economy was key to understand, because, as I said, billions and trillions were in today's worth were made. So all this thing about the oligarchs, all this thing about corruption, Navalny. Who is Navalny? Essentially, Navalny is an anti-corruption blogger who became a political leader because he was pointing finger at corrupt officials. Oligarchs or government officials. So again, if he's right, and by the way, unfortunately, because in a way I do respect Navalny, because he was a courageous man. Okay, there's no doubt about that. But he did support Browder's version of the Magnitsky Act. And there was, people may be forgetting now about Magnitsky because there, the war and the other events that eclipse Magnitsky case. But Magnitsky, as you rightly say, and Alex and Glenn, it was there before Ukraine. It was the first salvo in the new Cold War. So is Browder right? And most of the Western media who repeat his narrative. If they're wrong, unfortunately, the story of the relationship between the West and Russia, which led up to this terrible, of course, it's horrible war. I know I can't read the news every day. Hundreds of, at least, best thousands maybe dying. this is a terrible tragedy, and we're not through it yet, despite all the promises, Trump to finish it. So this whole thing is it appears in a slightly different light. That's why I find we still must go back and see who was right. Is the narrative of Russia being basically looted by their own oligarchs? Fine. I'm not saying not fine, horrible, but under the West basically a watch, because that wouldn't have been possible be without Western encouragement. Yes, the West had the experience, the West had the knowledge. So if they abuse this knowledge to help at least basically rip off Russia, that is the key question. At least for the Russians, believe you me, maybe the West watches it differently, because I have my sort of Western cap and my Russian cap. But as someone born there, still having a lot of friends, and having been the member of the Russian opposition, I ask you to believe that this is the key question to understanding Russia today.
I found it also interesting that the whole presentation of Browder, also how he went from having this financial empire to suddenly selling himself as a human rights activist, because he was quite supportive of President Putin as well. But I guess as much like the other oligarchs who Putin started to sideline in the early 2000s, he then, of course, turned on Putin, and he also then began to frame himself as Putin's enemy number one. But it's quite interesting that this whole, when we frame everything as this good versus evil narrative, that suddenly Bill Browder's financial power and activities in Russia suddenly just became innocent. That this was all as if he hadn't done anything wrong. While Magnitsky became suddenly a lawyer, he became a whistleblower and was murdered. And even though this story is full of holes, and a lot of it can be proven as being fake, the narrative kind of continues to live on, irrespective of the facts. And I agree with what Alexander said as well, that this whole, not just this narrative which launched Browder into the political sphere, and essentially because he was able to serve a story which was so wonderful that the West, our journalists, couldn't possibly criticize it. But it just seems as if this is a continuous story, this idea that whenever we criticize Russia, it always has to come from this position of moral superiority, that it's human rights versus lack thereof, or liberal democracy versus authoritarianism. And I think it has an important role, because when you mentioned Fukuyama, when you set up this narrative of the end of history, one of liberal hegemony, where the whole world would align under Western rule and values, it's all premised on peaceful dominance. That is, our interference into Russia then would be benign. We're just teaching them about capitalism, effectively. But this is, I noticed one thing in the documentary in which you were interviewing Browder, and you had some questions about Magnitsky's, I think it was related to whether or not he was a whistleblower. And I found it interesting that immediately he suggested that, well, if you challenge this narrative, this is what the FSB attempts to do, and this will be very harmful for your reputation. And it's just, it seems like this is always the playbook. That is, one can present cold, hard facts. At least this is what I'm discovering. And instead of addressing these facts, I see someone will question your motivations, your loyalties. They will throw out emotional rhetoric, slogans. And this has kind of been a very continuous path, from criticism about NATO expansion from the 90s, the whole Russiagate years, the Ukraine war. Often there are cold, hard facts which goes strictly against the narrative, and well, it's always it never stands up. Facts never get to challenge the narrative, and it's something we continue to see. But
Well,
yeah, sorry, I had a
exactly. It's an ideological approach. I kind of I also ask people to separate. There is an ideological approach or factual and historical dialectical. I just said, of course, it's not black and white. No, the it's not either or. Of course, there were a lot of people in Russia actually tell me, look, the 90s were not just about Western expansion, economic expansion. Some of the things were good. Of course, it's not either or. The people were who now say that the Soviet Union, for example, also showed the Soviet Union was not all bad. It was not, like Nazi Germany, whatever. People often compare that, evil. But a lot of Ukrainians, some of my Ukrainian friends, and that's a lot of friends, the Soviet Union was just like Nazi Germany, so it had to be destroyed, or it fortunately destroyed itself. But of course, I was even critical of the Soviet Union. But you can also say that there was some peaceful coexistence of those nations. The moment the Soviet Union collapsed, we had the war in Chechnya and sort of a series of bloody conflicts. So you have to look at these things dialectically. Of course, Russia was on its knees. Russia failed. The Soviet Union, failed economically. There's no question about it. But having said that, you have to then look at those facts. Look at tax evasion cases where rich Western hedge fund managers operate in poverty-stricken regions, like in the Magnitsky case, in Kalmykia, where people where Browder used loopholes, tax loopholes, and claimed he paid like 5 times minimum wage, but 5 times minimum wage was still like absolute pittance. So if you don't look at these facts, 5 times minimum wage will sound, wow, it's very impressive. But when you look at the facts, you realize that he abused those tax loopholes, hired people who couldn't even speak Russian properly as financial consultants, which is a clear abuse. Russian law allowed some tax breaks if you allow hire people from Kalmykia, and there's a long list of these facts which make Russian investigation, even Russian conviction. Brod is convicted of aggravated tax evasion in Russia. It makes it all real, but who cares? But who has the patience of looking at the fact? Even journalists who specialize in, even I, failed to notice all these things, believing Browder for political reasons. So what I'm saying, it is natural even, but when I just doing my job and having actually for a change, looked at the facts, looked at all those boring-looking documents. I then, instead, people can make mistakes. People make mistakes all the time. But when I, in good faith, just doing my job, being, by the way, financed, this film was financed exclusively by the Western, and not just Western organization, but mainstream, mostly publicly funded Western organizations. People whose commission editors worked closely with me were making this film. I was making it creatively, but they approved of it. They approved it, on all levels, and even praised me, for doing a great job. When the film is out and be attacked by a private individual, by just some rich American-born guy, who suddenly seems to have influence in all echelons of power in Europe, and of America, of course. But the film was sort of banned and cancelled in Europe. We couldn't. We planned, but couldn't show it at the European Parliament. At the last moment, it was cancelled. When these things happen, facts of clear censorship. This is something extremely troubling, and not for Russia. As I keep saying, this is no longer a Russian story. This was, for me, a shocking example that something is seriously wrong with the Western system. As you say, the narrative control, information control, and I sort of I was, I don't want to call myself a victim, but for a few years, I was, hounded down, but by the fact that and by the way, different organizations, of those who had supported the film, their argument was they were not consistent. They were contradictory in their arguments. Some would say, I don't want to mention which, but there was basically mainstream TV and news organizations and film funds. By the way, the Norwegian Film Foundation the Norwegian Film Fund did believe me and did support me, but the majority of those who had supported us and then were planning to show the film kind of betrayed me in a way. But their argument was always different. Some would say, we're too busy. We can't. We don't have resources to check your story. Having worked with me, on it and praised me, then others said, okay, there's technical legal reason and a ridiculous one in that. You had to Browder had to know. Mr. Browder claims that you'd approached him on a false pretense, that you were going to make a positive film about Magnitsky and himself. And then it turned into something else. Well, I never promised Browder. I'm a filmmaker, but also investigative journalist. I never promised Browder, some sort of pre-planned outcome. I was investigating. I was asking him, in good faith, specific questions. I think he failed to answer them convincingly, and that's what I publish. I never promised, to eulogize him or to make something. A propaganda piece. That's I suppose what for his case. That's what unfortunately a lot of some journalists did. So it's shocking, because we in the Soviet Union, we grew up believing that, okay, every system essentially praises itself. The Soviet Union was going on about, fairness to workers, criticism of capitalism. The West was going on about its freedoms. Okay, of course, capitalism is not ideal, but it's better. As Churchill said, on balance, it's better than others. But essentially, every system praises itself. Okay, so that wasn't a surprise for me when I arrived in the West. What was, and I was hoping that, okay, systems praise themselves, but what the West does, it allows debate. Okay, it allows people they consider sort of mistaken, not evil. You should not allow sort of hate speech or anti-Semitism or or propaganda of violence. That should be banned always in all societies. But people you disagree with, you give them a say. You listen them out. You hear them out. That's what the Soviet Union was sort of slightly worse about. But here we are. I feel sometimes I feel I'm back. Back in the USSR, so to speak, because I had that experience. I was young still, but I remember those days. I'm old enough to remember them. I have this sort of eerie feeling. I'm not. I don't care about myself in this case, but people don't get their say, don't get the minimum of say, when they have a different opinion. And that's very dangerous, because I think that's what leads to wars, I'm afraid. When society doesn't allow, John Stuart Mill, for God's sake, read them, read the classics. If the right opinion, who's to judge? Because it's a process. But the opinion which is considered to be right by the majority, by the government, by the good people, if it's not tested enough, and I can't quote John Stuart Mill, but it's a very simple idea. If the opponent is not given enough time or opportunity to challenge the right opinion, all is right, but give the society becomes tyranny. And I would add to that, sorry to be so presumptuous, it also leads to wars.
I would completely agree. I mean, there's a quote actually by supposedly by Cromwell, whether he really said it, in which he apparently spoke to the British Parliament and said, "Please God, just consider the possibility that you might be mistaken." and that was done in the 1640s. You mentioned British history of that time, that we were going through a very, very complicated revolutionary process which continued right up into the 18th century. But in a sense, that was when the concept of free debate began to crack through, because until then, not widely known fact, but there was very, very severe censorship in England. There had been in Shakespeare's day. Shakespeare's plays are full of political allusions, which very few people pick up on today. So I absolutely agree. And can I just say, it's not just free speech, it's due process. The fact that, as you correctly said, people were sanctioned as a result of the Magnitsky Act, which is in a way of calling them guilty of a particular crime for which they have never been prosecuted and which they're never given an opportunity to defend themselves. Once upon a time, that would have been absolutely unthinkable within my own lifetime. It would have been considered unthinkable that individual sanctions could be used in that kind of way. And of all the controls, the media controls that we see, the attempts to control other forms of debate and discussion. And of course, it's undermining the one thing which was in some ways, or in many respects, the most attractive single thing about Western societies. And one of the things that made Western societies stable, the fact that one could hold open discussions and one could look for debates which might ultimately point you to solutions. And it meant that problems and disputes could be mediated in particular ways. Do you think it's changing? Do you think that in the West we're starting to move away from this, that we're reverting? I mean, we now have people in the United States talking about the First Amendment of the Constitution again. There are lawyers I know who are very worried about the way things have gone in the United States. There seems to be a swing back in the United States. I get the sense that in Europe the direction continues to be very much, however, along the trajectory that you just outlined.
Yeah, I think, yeah, as I said, I have this very strange déjà vu feeling that kind of ideology, and of course, the West, people would not agree. Most people would not agree that there is ideology. They'd say, okay, there's what is ideology? Ideology is obviously communist ideology. There was a Nazi ideology. We don't have ideology. We have some narratives, but we have freedom, and we have no society is ideal, of course, but there's no ideology in the sense that sort of ideas and a theory and a set of values that controls information, but it does, I'm afraid. And of course, you cannot allow certain things to provoke people. You can't allow hate speech. You can't allow a lot of things that kind of trigger irrational reaction in society, because there's no clear separation, of course, between
can I just make
debate. Yeah.
Can I just make a quick point, which is incitement? Incitement has always been a crime. It is a crime under the common law. So, I mean, that has not been something that has ever been a legal.
Yeah, of course.
In any country.
But of course. But what's happening, in my humble opinion, is that those borderlines are blurred, and I'm incitement, okay, fine, of course, but what about conspiracy theory?
Yeah.
If you look at it, what is the exact definition? Who said that this is a conspiracy theory and this is a line of investigation?
Yeah.
This is a legitimate version, a legitimate set of questioning. Who said that if you question something, you are in the conspiracy theory area? So and again, there are conspiracy theories, but what I'm saying, that what I feel that the kind of the immunity system of Western societies, I've been to the States many times, but I speak about Europe, because there may be slight differences now, okay, especially coming up, yeah. But certainly Europe feels very conformist. European societies feel very conformist to me, and acknowledging a problem. Not even sort of forgiving some conspiracy theories, or allowing a bit more questioning, a bit more analysis, not being kind of rejected of the bat, but as we were mentioning, the keyword debate. there must be, society must invest literally, even financially, because public TV, you see more and more on BBC and others, quality or not maybe, but sometimes I wonder. But and the Magnitsky case, let's not talk generally, even though it's important to talk about other cases. But in Magnitsky case, unfortunately, BBC, and I worked for them. I did films for Storyville. I know still people there, journalists. But with the Magnitsky case, they failed completely. They just repeated the version of one private individual, Bill Browder, and there was no debate or kind of vetting of my film, which I repeat was made by mainstream paid. It was a relatively big budget film, so it made by Arte, the Norwegians, the Finns, the Germans, the French. It was a big event in the documentary world. It was was to be shown in a flagship investigative slot, in many countries, and so it's not just a comment, on the web. So, and we did, my colleagues and I did in the politest of ways, tried to. We send the film around. We presented our arguments. I wrote articles. We have a website. We asked for more interviews. We tried to get into many fora to talk about it. It wasn't violent. It wasn't in any sense. It wasn't even over emotional. Even though, of course, imagine being called a Russian agent or a liar. Or I was once compared with Breivik, film being made in Norway originally. That I call extreme. Calling someone a liar is extreme, and that was not even the worst. So, people contradicting themselves. Andreas Gross, who was the rapporteur for the Council of Europe. Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. He told me, and it's in the film. He told me Magnitsky was not murdered. I even said then I wasn't even sure myself. I almost quote. I was saying, but he was killed in a way, or maybe really, or killed. He interrupted me. He said, no, he wasn't murdered. Murder is too much a definition here. It was, and he said it in German. He's Swiss. Basically. The English equivalent would be not taken care of. He was basically it was a case of neglect. He's telling me in his office, and then because of the pressure and because he felt personally kind of, I didn't call him a liar, but I said, look, you're contradicting yourself. And I said it in the film. I pointed out contradictions in the film, and he turned around, and there was a full-blown attack on me in the German press, for example. So, and then the German Bundestag members, not just Marie-Louise Beck, you mentioned others, and almost like we think there was an order from the government or from the ruling party, which was the CDU, then basically the order to the ZDF, which is public TV in Germany, or suggestion or advice not to show the film. And we have names and this, I think it's an extraordinary case of censorship and really unfair and shabby treatment of people who had nothing to gain from this, who were just doing a job in the West. I've never worked in Russia. Actually, I was born there, but I'm not a Russian journalist. I'm not a Russian. I've nothing to do with the Russian system. I understand the language. I know the history, but this should be an advantage. Another thing is most things Russians are basically dismissed. I mean, they are treated with suspicion. Russian name, an attempt to explain things historically, in giving context to things is immediately written off as propaganda, or in German there's this ugly word Putin verstehe, and someone who understands Putin. Because understanding, for God's sake, means so many things in German, in English, in all languages. You have to understand in order to not put in a sort of way, not agreeing with or not. Understanding in the sense of forgiving everything, of course not, but understanding Russia is a prerequisite for dealing with Russia, for a successful, effective dealing. Because if you don't understand and you lose. You even lose physically, I'm afraid. You have to understand to make peace, to do constructive things, to cooperate, because we're on this small planet, which is
Seems that free speech, though, it's very difficult to maintain when you have this demand, this extreme demand for conformity, because these days, as you suggested, any deviation from the narrative is immediately punished. We use words. You mentioned disinformation. I've had that thrown at me before, but no one ever has the obligation, even though making such a claim, to explain what exact information was not true. I've heard the word controversial, but what exactly it means, what's the meaning of a controversial if we don't explore how the main opinions or consensus was reached? Again, conspiracy thrown around. One of my favorites is being accused of being pro-Russian. No one really explained this one either, what it means. Does one have to criticize everything the Russian government does? Do we have to hate the Russian people as well? It's very strange comments, but they all has the same function, which is to silence and censor. And at the end of the day, it always results in the same, which is some of the, again, basic facts, whether or not they can be confirmed or disconfirmed. This is just neglected, and it does feel that ideology is some of the source behind this conformity, though. As I mentioned before, this demand ideological conformity to liberal hegemony, the assumption that the West has to be a force for good, that is, the dominance is benign. Once this forced to accept this, we see that journalists becomes more or less activists. They censor away information, or self-censor, that doesn't fit the narrative. And often it's under the assumption that they're fighting a good fight. They're
of course,
cheering for the right side. But we end up with this difficult situation where you see from France to Germany, where it's seen as necessary to protect democracy by marginalizing the opposition. Again, from the Russia Gate lies to Magnitsky Act, none of the I guess fraudulent or fake information, no one's ever held accountable, because at least they picked the right side. They repeated the narrative of our side as opposed to the Russian. So it's I think it's a problem, as also Alexander pointed out. This is without this freedom of speech, we can't identify problems, we can't come with solutions, and we can't have any course correction. And I think this is why we're in very deep
Well,
trouble.
that's why we're where we are, and it's kind of do it at your peril thing. One thing is this moral. People are entitled to their moral judgments. People cannot know everything. Let alone the technicalities of the Magnitsky case. I don't demand people. I don't blame people. After all, I myself believe Browder, and I'm not the least attentive person. So I must have made some mistakes. So I had made some judgments without checking the documents. But once there is a case like the case with my film, the film was banned at the European Parliament. The screening was cancelled at the last moment. The film was banned by film festivals. It was in the press. If I look at this without knowing most things, we don't know things about most things about the world. But okay, there seems to be a genuine attempt to get to the bottom of a case like the Magnitsky. Hear the guy out. Show the film. Let's have a fair debate. Because if you don't, in this case, the opponent was Russian Federation before the invasion of 2022, and you presume, and by the way, even before 2014, okay, the Magnitsky case started before 2014. So it just so happens that this financial crime case became a key to a not debate, because there wasn't a debate, but a conflict between the West and Russia. So it involves the Russian government, who had not yet invaded Ukraine, but was very angry because people were and I know some names, so it had nothing to do. They didn't have met Magnitsky. They were not involved in the case. They were then called by the Russian government, by the way, to try and objectively, because there was a scandal. So there were police officers and investigators called after Magnitsky's death, who had nothing to do in the initial investigation, tax fraud, which would then basically, and it turned out to be genuine, but according to the European Court of Human Rights, but who had not been involved and were asked to look into this objectively, the Russians, and then they were put on the Magnitsky sanctions list just for trying to find out the truth, to get to the bottom of the story. So what happens is that you kind of provoke all those people, antagonize them into saying, the West the West is prejudiced, the Western governments are prejudiced, the Western media is prejudiced against us. It's not fair, and you create this community of people who who have no right, as Alex said, to defend themselves. There's no due process, and you create a public opinion which then support what of course this doesn't justify killing civilians, but history doesn't work in those black and white terms. It's gradual. There's this critical mass which is being formed, and which then decides when the war starts. Then it becomes very black and white, unfortunately. So that's how things work. So that's why I say ignore it at your peril. That's why I say the lack of debate eventually leads to war.
Yeah,
which is not of course to justify the measure, but it's almost like Volens Nolens. It's not me. I hate describing some processes. I feel they are extremely tragic, and I can only regret what's been going on. But I'm trying to kind of to, in a way, I was a witness to some of these processes. I was a witness of people, of innocent people, and they happen to be Russians. Yes, there are some innocent Russians being kind of lied about publicly. You know, they have children, they have their family. They were called, thieves, if not murderers, of Magnitsky. So what did they have to tell their families? You know, let alone some of them, you know, the sanctions means your accounts are frozen, you can't travel to the West. Some of them had no accounts; they didn't want to travel. But there's also this moral element, and you can't defend yourself. You know, nobody is going to hear you out. So this is not fair, and it's even worse than it appears at the first sight. You know, some Russians being treated unfairly. So what? No, everything accumulates, and everything has consequences.
Indeed, so there's just two things I wanted to just finish on my part on. One was about police officers in Russia having been falsely accused of things they didn't do. One case did just manage to get its foot through the door in a high court in London. It didn't go very far because it came up against overwhelming jurisdictional problems. But the judge in the case, a high court judge, very well known, highly respected high court judge, on the basis simply of reading the submissions, the submissions the lawyers of the policeman had submitted on his behalf, but also the submissions that Browder and his legal team had also submitted, simply on the basis of the submissions, actually made a factual finding that the police officer in question, who had been alleged to have been involved in Magnitsky's death, had no part in it whatsoever. So there was one example of the narrative, if you like, which crumbled when it was actually scrutinized properly by a judge. That proved very difficult to do. Even in that case, the case wasn't able to go very far. And of course, in most other cases, that didn't happen. But there has been already that one decision, which perhaps one ought to bear in mind. Part of that narrative, the Magnitsky narrative, it was looked at and it wasn't sustainable in a court. The second thing is about controversy and about controversial things. One of the films I remember watching when I was a student was The Battle of Algiers. Now, that was a very controversial film in its day, extremely controversial. Many people in France didn't like it. Many people in France criticized it. Was it banned? Was it suppressed? Did we say to ourselves we shouldn't watch that film? Of course not. And I think today it's universally recognized as a classic. It's discussed by film historians. And of course, it sparked a huge political debate. And people looking into the history and what had happened in France itself, and that was how it should be. That is what partly literature, film, art have always been for. They are about controversy, not suppressing controversy. The notion of suppressing controversy in art is an absurd one. It is to misunderstand completely what art is and what it's for. At least that is my own view.
I totally agree.
Yeah, just final comment on what you mentioned about this lack of debates resulting in war. I think that's also true to a large extent with the current war in Ukraine. I mean, if we would have been, I guess, allowed to have a proper debate about the consequences of NATO expansion, at least also allowed to discuss Russian security concerns, if this wasn't taboo, I think if the revelations from Russiagate, someone had been held accountable, at least we reflect upon the misinformation over years. If there had been proper debates in the media about the coup in 2014, Victoria Nuland's involvement, the secret wars and CIA bases, if we had been allowed to discuss or have a debate about the sabotage of Minsk agreement, the sabotage of the Istanbul negotiations, even Nord Stream, I find this to be the most obvious case, as the Americans now admit that they knew it was an attack, that the Russians did not attack these gas pipelines, and nonetheless they still used it as an excuse for escalating the war in Ukraine and militarizing the Baltic Sea. But still, no journalist would ever want to touch it, because again, if they criticize it, then they're seen as taking, Russia's side versus America, something you can't do. So instead, they're more comfortable saying lies, effectively pretending it never happened. And I think Magnitsky Act falls in this case as well. There's, again, proven to be a fraudulent case, to build narratives of good versus evil, to push sanctions, again, replace the Jackson Vanik, and of course also become a case of censorship. What happens when the facts do not fit the narrative? So no, it's quite troubling. So I would urge anyone, all our listeners to this, to watch the movie by Andrei Nekrasov on the Magnitsky Act. It's it can still be found places, as Alexander said. I found it myself on Rumble. So yes. Anyways, any final words before we wrap up?
Just to repeat again, to absolutely watch that film. It retains its full relevance, in my opinion, to this day. It is absolutely as topical now as when it was made.
Well, I just want to thank you. And when I criticize the West, people must understand that I'm that generation which of the Russians, which looked up to the West. I read Marx, unlike a lot of Russians, by the way, because they were kind of fed up with the propaganda. And I was generally much more left-wing than average. And you probably know that a lot of Russians are now, even those who are kind of against the Putin government, they tend to be right-wing. Because it's a historical it's understandable to a certain extent, because we had the government sort of, which is kind of a right-wing concept, government control, whatever, was communist theoretically. So you have this reverse sort of picture there, like the looking glass sort of. But we looked up to the West for good reasons, because there was debate. There was debate. As a sort of left-wing leaning person, I wasn't in love with capitalism as a system, but on balance, it was more free. And the examples you mention, it probably was more free in my field, and I'm a filmmaker and writer, and in my field, of course, there was more freedom, technically in the West. For example, the left wing, the people who criticized, and sometimes very harshly, the governments in the West, they were allowed, in France and in America, even, they were allowed to criticize their governments. And that, as Glenn rightly said, that's what art is all about. You cannot, you know enough about art or writing, so to understand that. You cannot function as an artist, as a creative person, if you don't debate with yourself, with society, with your opponents. It's about dialectics. You cannot. Art is not a slogan. They're excellent, catchy slogans, but that's another kind of activity. It's always about contradictory nature of politics, of society, even of human being, and it's all such our psychology, and it's all interconnected. So, for God's sake, my sort of last word, whoever will listen to it, if you don't want to save, I don't know. From my point of view, save culture, because culture culture is the source of politics, and even for the culture's sake, what we tend to watch is more and more just entertainment. Even if it's about issues seem to be, for some reason, all alike. In advance, the films, as far as I'm concerned, are extremely formulaic, and it's okay. People need to be entertained. There are all kinds of tastes. Go for your blockbuster, but leave some of the art and creative work as it should be. Contradictory, asking hard questions. Otherwise, what we know as the West, the West is guilty of colonialism and other things. But as a Russian, I was looking up to it. So I just hope it'll the good thing will be saved, and the good thing is about debate and different opinions. And as I said, remember John Stuart Mill. It will become tyranny unless the right ideas are allowed to be challenged by people who question them. Defeat them in debate, but not with censorship, please.
Andrei, thank you very much. Andrei Nekrasov, thank you very, very much.
Thank you.